The single copper penny caught the afternoon light like a dying star, and Nellie Beckett watched it spin in her palm with the quiet certainty that this was the last coin she owned in the world, and she was about to throw it away on a broken horse. The town of Caldwell, Kansas, sat blistering under the July sun of 1879, the kind of heat that warped the wooden storefronts and made the air above the main road shimmer like something dreamed up by a fevered mind. Cattle trails converged here, and with them came the dust, the noise, the smell of livestock and sweating men, and the particular brand of desperation that followed anyone who had ridden too far on too little. Nellie had walked the last 6 miles into town because her horse had gone lame outside of Wichita, and she had sold the saddle to pay for lodging 2 nights ago, and then sold the horse itself for half what it was worth just to keep eating. Now, she stood at the edge of the crowd gathered around a makeshift paddock near the edge of town, listening to a man in a dirty red vest shout about a horse race to be held that very afternoon, and something about the scene before her made her stop walking entirely. The horse in question stood apart from the others in the paddock, and Nellie understood immediately why every sensible bettor was looking elsewhere. It was a roan stallion, lean and tall, with a coat the color of dried blood and a wild, rolling eye that suggested it had opinions about the world that it intended to share loudly. Its left foreleg bore a faded scar, the kind that came from an old injury, healed wrong maybe, or healed slow. It favored that leg only slightly, a hesitation rather than a limp, but in a race that was enough to send gamblers toward the other horses. The roan stood with its ears pinned back, and its tail switching irritably, clearly uninterested in being looked at or handled or discussed by the gathered crowd. Every other horse in the paddock was groomed and pranced about by handlers who wanted the bettors to see what they were putting their money toward. The roan had no handler near it. The man who owned it stood a distance apart, leaning against the paddock fence with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low, watching the horse with the particular expression of a man who was arguing with himself about something he had already decided. Nellie noticed him, the way you notice something that seems out of place in a familiar picture. He was maybe 28 or 29, broad-shouldered in the way that came from actual work rather than show, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of a worn but clean canvas shirt. His boots were scuffed and honest. His jaw held a few days of dark stubble. He wore no flashy spurs, no embroidered vest, none of the decorative trappings that the showier cowboys affected. He looked, in short, like a man who had no interest in being noticed, which was perhaps why Nellie noticed him immediately. But it was the horse that pulled her focus back. The roan stamped and shifted, and even in that restless movement Nellie could see something in the animal's muscle structure that the casual observer was missing. She had grown up around horses on her father's farm outside of Nashville before the war had taken the farm and the war had taken her father, and the years after had taken nearly everything else. She knew horses the way some women knew scripture, from long necessity and deep attention. The roan's hindquarters were powerful. The chest was deep. The injury to the foreleg was old, and old injuries in horses, when they had healed at all, often healed with compensatory strength in surrounding muscle. What the crowd saw was a scar and a slight hesitation. What Nellie saw was a horse that had been forced to carry itself differently for years and had built itself accordingly. She looked at the odds posted on the board near the betting table. The roan was listed last, at odds that made her breath catch just slightly. If the horse won, even a single penny bet would return enough to change her circumstances substantially. Not enormously, but enough. Enough for a room for a week. Enough for food that was not yesterday's bread. Enough to perhaps buy passage west on the stagecoach and reach Dodge City, where her mother's cousin had a boarding house and had written twice to say there was work if Nellie wanted it. She had wanted it very much. She had just not had the means to get there. The penny was warm in her hand. She closed her fingers around it. She looked at the roan again. Then she looked at the man leaning against the fence. She walked toward him. He did not look up as she approached, though she suspected he was aware of her. Men who stood that quietly in noisy places were always more aware of their surroundings than they appeared. "That your horse?" she asked. He lifted his head then, and she saw that his eyes were a very dark gray, the color of a sky that had not yet decided whether to storm. He looked at her with an expression that was not unfriendly but was distinctly guarded, the look of a man who had learned that conversations beginning with that question rarely ended simply. "Yes, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not waste itself on extra words. "What happened to his leg?" she asked. Something shifted in the man's expression. A slight narrowing of those gray eyes, a faint recalibration of his assessment of her. "Old wire cut. 2 years back. He was green and spooked into a fence line." "Did he ever go fully lame?" "For about 3 months. And now he runs when he wants to," the man said, and there was something in his tone that suggested this was a source of ongoing frustration and complicated pride. "Whether he wants to at any given moment is a different matter." Nellie looked back at the horse. "He wants to today," she said. It was not a question exactly, but it was not quite a statement either. The man pushed off from the fence slowly and looked at the roan himself, and the look he gave the horse was long and complicated and entirely unreadable to anyone who was not paying close attention. Nellie was paying close attention. She saw something in his face that looked almost like worry, not for himself, for the horse. "I'm Ira Crawford," he said, by way of not answering her statement. "Nellie Beckett," she said. He extended his hand and they shook, which was unusual enough in 1879 that he gave her a brief second look of recalibration. Her grip was firm. Her hand was calloused. She was not a soft woman who had fallen on hard times. She was a working woman who had simply run out of work. "You thinking about placing a bet, Miss Beckett?" "I am," she said. She opened her hand and showed him the penny. She watched his face and gave him credit for not laughing, or even for letting the corners of his mouth shift. "That's the last of it," he said, and again it was not quite a question. "That's the last of it," she confirmed. Ira Crawford looked at the penny. He looked at the roan, who was stamping again and watching the far end of the paddock with bright, intelligent eyes. He looked back at Nellie Beckett, at the set of her jaw and the clear steadiness of her gaze and the worn hem of her dress that had been mended and worn down and mended again. "I wouldn't bet on that horse," he said carefully. "I know you wouldn't," she said. "You're the owner and you're standing over here instead of over there. If you believed he would run today, you'd be at the betting table." She paused. "I watched you watching him for the last 10 minutes before I walked over. You want him to run. You're not sure he will." Ira Crawford was quiet for a moment. "You're very observant," he said finally. "I'm very broke," she said. "It sharpens the mind considerably." Something moved through his expression then, something that was not quite a smile but was the antecedent of one. "The horse's name is Cinder," he said. "He's 9 years old and he's been racing on and off for 3 years since the injury. He wins about half the time. The other half he decides he doesn't feel like it and just stops somewhere in the middle, and nobody can make him move again until he's ready." He paused. "He once stopped directly in front of the judge's stand at a race in Abilene, sat down, and refused to move for 40 minutes. Nellie looked at the horse. The horse, as if aware of being discussed, flicked its tail and turned its large, expressive head toward her with an air of dignified indifference. "But when he runs," she said. Ira's jaw tightened slightly. "When he runs," he said quietly, "he's the fastest thing I've ever seen." She looked at him directly. "Then I'm going to bet this penny on your horse, Mr. Crawford." "Miss Beckett," he said, and his voice carried something careful in it, something that sounded like genuine discomfort. "I'd feel a great deal better if you didn't do that." "Why?" she asked. "It's my penny. Because if he decides not to run today, you lose everything you have, and I'll have to stand here knowing that happened and that I let you walk over to that table." The plainness of it stopped her for a moment. There was no performance in the words, no attempt to seem gallant or impressive. He simply said the thing he meant, with the directness of a man who had long since given up on the alternative. "You don't know me," she said. "No," he agreed. "You don't owe me anything." "No," he said again. "Then why does it matter to you what happens to my penny?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the horse. I don't entirely know, he said honestly. But it does. Nellie Beckett had been offered many things by men in the last 3 years of her hard traveling life, and almost none of those offerings had come from a place of genuine consideration rather than expectation. She had learned to read the difference the way she read horses, from close attention and long practice. She looked at Ira Crawford now and read him as carefully as she had read Cinder, and what she found there surprised her. "I'm going to place the bet," she said. "But I want to watch him from here, with you, if that's agreeable." He looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression settled into a kind of quiet acceptance. "That's agreeable," he said. She walked to the betting table and placed her penny on Cinder's name in the ledger, and the man behind the table looked at the coin, and then looked at her with an expression that suggested he found penny bets beneath his administrative dignity but was too professionally bland to say so. She accepted her betting slip and walked back to where Ira Crawford stood at the fence. They stood together in silence for a few minutes, watching the other horses being paraded and the crowd placing their money and the red-vested announcer working himself into a theatrical enthusiasm. The sun bore down on them both with absolute impartiality. "Where are you headed?" Ira asked, not impertinently, the way you ask someone on a long road if they have far to go. "Dodge City," she said. "My mother's cousin has a boarding house. She's offered me work." "Housekeeping." "Cooking," she said. "Possibly some bookkeeping. I'm decent with numbers." She paused. "I'm decent with a lot of things, actually. I've just had a difficult 2 years finding anyone willing to pay me for any of them." "What kind of things?" She glanced at him. He was not asking in the forward way some men did, the way that wanted to catalog her usefulness or her vulnerability. He was asking in the way people ask when they are genuinely curious about another person. "Horses," she said. "Figures. Cooking, though I'd rather not make a life of it. I can read and write well, which is more than most people out here can say, and I know I shouldn't say it, but it's true. I had a year of schooling in Nashville before everything fell apart." "The war?" he asked. "The war," she confirmed. "My father was killed at Chickamauga. My mother died of fever 2 years after. I've been moving west since then, looking for something that would stick." She said it simply, without dramatizing it or minimizing it, the way you describe geography rather than catastrophe. He heard the weight in it anyway. "I'm sorry," he said, and that too was direct and genuine without the clumsy addition of comparisons or silver linings. "What about you?" she asked. "You from Kansas?" "Texas originally," he said. "Grew up near Amarillo. Drove cattle north with a crew for 3 years, then decided I was tired of working for other people's herds. Been building my own small operation up near Medicine Lodge for the past 4 years. He paused. "It's coming along, slowly. And the horse?" "Cinder is not exactly part of the operation," he said, with a tone that suggested this was something he had explained before, possibly to himself. "I bought him off a man who was going to put him down after the wire injury. He was 3 years old, it seemed." He stopped, reconsidered. It seemed wrong to let that happen. He was worth saving. "Even though he sometimes sits down in front of judges' stands," Nellie said. "Even though," Ira agreed, and this time there was definitely the beginning of a smile in his voice, barely there, carefully contained. The race was called 15 minutes later. 6 horses were walked to the starting line at the far end of the main road, which had been cleared and roped off for the event. Cinder went to the line with the look of a professor forced to attend a party he had not organized, tolerant but uninvested. The other horses shifted and champed and pulled at their riders with the bright, stupid eagerness of animals bred for exactly this moment. Cinder simply stood there. "He doesn't look excited," Nellie said. "He never does before he starts," Ira said quietly. He had leaned forward against the fence now, both forearms on the top rail, his whole attention on the horse 60 yards away. He was very still. Nellie watched his face instead of the horse for a moment. There was something in his expression that was almost painful to look at, the naked investment of a man watching something he cared about deeply and could not control at all. She had the sudden and unexpected thought that she had not seen a man look at anything with that particular quality of unguarded feeling in a very long time. She looked back at the starting line. The gun fired. 5 horses lunged forward with an immediate, explosive burst of motion. Cinder did not move for precisely 2 full seconds, which in the context of a horse race felt like a small geological era. Nellie's hand tightened involuntarily around the wooden fence post beside her. Then Cinder ran. She had heard the phrase in books, the ground seemed to shake, and had always taken it for the exaggeration of writers who needed something to say. But when Cinder opened up into his full stride, something in the earth below her feet did transmit an intimation of that kind of power, the deep percussion of a big horse running with its entire body, every coordinated pound of muscle and bone working in one direction at one speed. The slight hesitation she had noticed in his foreleg at rest vanished entirely at speed. He ran clean and level and absolutely committed. He passed the first horse before the first quarter of the road. He was at the second by halfway. By the final stretch he had gone past 3 more and was pulling up even with the leader, a bay gelding from out of Wichita that had won 3 races in the past month and was priced accordingly. The crowd was shouting. Ira Crawford had gone entirely silent and entirely motionless beside her, not even breathing visibly. Cinder won by 2 lengths. The crowd made the kind of noise that crowds make when they have witnessed something that exceeded their expectations, a general communal exhalation of surprise and pleasure. The few people who had bet on Cinder, an eccentric minority, were considerably louder than everyone else. Nellie Beckett let out a long, shaking breath. Ira Crawford closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds his face was completely open and undefended, something between relief and joy and something she could not quite name, a feeling too large for just winning a race. She thought it might be something more like vindication, proof of something he had believed when no one else did. He opened his eyes. He saw her watching him. Neither of them looked away immediately, which was the kind of moment that later you trace back as the place where everything changed, though you rarely recognize it at the time. "Your penny multiplied," he said, his voice slightly rougher than before. "It did," she said. She collected her winnings at the table, and the sum, while not enormous, was enough to make her hands feel less cold even in the July heat, enough for passage to Dodge City on the next stage, with a little besides. She folded the bills carefully and put them in the small interior pocket of her dress, where she kept the things she could not afford to lose. She turned to find Ira Crawford leading Cinder out of the paddock, speaking to the horse in a low, private way that was clearly not intended for anyone else's ears. Cinder had the expression of an animal accepting congratulations with appropriate dignity. Nellie walked over. "He ran beautifully," she said. Ira looked up. "He did." He stroked the horse's neck once, a brief, certain gesture. He usually does when he decides to. He paused, looking at her with that same careful, guarded attention. "Where are you staying tonight, Miss Beckett?" "I hadn't decided yet," she admitted. "I walked in this afternoon. I didn't expect to have the means to stay anywhere." She looked at the money in her hand and then at him. "I suppose I can afford the hotel now." "The hotel on the south end is clean," he said. "The one near the stockyards isn't." He hesitated, as though considering something. "There's a decent eating house 2 doors from the South Hotel, if you haven't eaten." The invitation was careful and tentative, offered with the manner of a man who was very aware of how such invitations could be received and was not interested in making anyone uncomfortable. Nellie appreciated the care in it. "I haven't eaten since this morning," she said. "I would appreciate that." They walked Cinder to the livery stable first, where Ira paid for the horse's board and spent a few minutes speaking to the liveryman about the animal's preferences and requirements with a specificity that made the liveryman's expression shift from professional to slightly impressed. Then they walked to the eating house, and they sat across from each other at a small table near the window, and in the ordinary light of an ordinary afternoon they began the process, cautiously and then less cautiously, of learning who the other person was. Nellie ordered the beef stew and ate it without self-consciousness, because she was hungry and it was good, and she had never understood the social performance of eating small amounts to seem delicate. Ira ordered the same and ate with the methodical quiet of a man who had spent many years eating alone and had made his peace with the lack of ceremony. They talked about horses for the first portion of the meal, which was comfortable territory for both of them. Then they talked about the land, the way Kansas had changed in the last decade, as the cattle trade had transformed the small frontier towns into booming, chaotic, occasionally violent hubs of commerce and conflict. They talked about the range wars that were starting to simmer between the cattlemen and the homesteaders, the fences going up across what had been open range, the old ways of the trail giving ground to the new arithmetic of settled land. Ira talked about his operation near Medicine Lodge carefully, the way people talk about things they are working very hard at and are not certain yet how to be proud of. 120 acres, he said, 30 head of cattle currently. A small house, functional if not comfortable, a barn that he'd built himself 2 summers ago and was genuinely satisfied with. "You built it yourself?" she asked. "I had some help the first week," he said. "After that, no. The neighbors are spread out and people are busy." "That must have been very lonely," she said, and said it directly, without softening it into something more socially acceptable. He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, "it was." The honesty of that exchange settled between them like something solid and welcome. She told him about Nashville and the years after, and the particular exhaustion of surviving on stubbornness alone, the drifting between towns, the work that never lasted, the way the West had appeared on the horizon of her imagination as a place where she might finally get ahead of the accumulated weight of bad luck and bad timing. She told him about the horse she had sold in Wichita and the saddle before that, and she told it without self-pity, which Ira Crawford seemed to understand was the only way she knew how to tell it. "Why didn't you settle somewhere earlier?" he asked. "You clearly have skills people need." "I did settle twice," she said. "Once in St. Louis, working for a family as a housekeeper. The wife didn't like me. I'm not sure exactly what about me she didn't like, but she made the decision in the first week and I lasted 6 months before she found a reason to let me go." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "The second time was in Wichita. I was working at a general store, managing the accounts. The owner sold the business and the new owner brought his own people." "That's a hard run of luck," he said. "It is," she agreed. "But I've been thinking lately that luck isn't entirely the right word for it. I think some of it is that I've been looking for places where I fit into what was already there, instead of looking for a place I could help build." She paused. "The boarding house in Dodge City is still small. My cousin's cousin built it herself after her husband died. She needs someone to work alongside her, not underneath her." Something in Ira's expression shifted subtly. "That's a thoughtful distinction," he said. "I've had a lot of time to think on it," she said, "walking the last 6 miles into town this afternoon." He smiled then, fully and without reservation, and it was a remarkable thing to see because it transformed his whole face, broke through that careful, contained quality, and showed something underneath that was warm and direct and genuinely delighted. Nellie felt the smile like a small, bright shock. The evening light was coming through the window at a long slant when they finally stood to leave. The eating house had filled around them and emptied again in the course of the conversation, and neither of them had entirely noticed. "The stage to Dodge runs tomorrow morning at 7, Ira said as they stepped outside into the cooling air. "If you're planning to be on it." "I am," she said. He nodded. There was a brief silence in which both of them were aware that the conversation was ending and neither of them entirely wanted it to. "Medicine Lodge is 60 miles from Dodge City," he said then, and the casualness of the statement was slightly too studied to be entirely casual. She looked at him. "I know where Medicine Lodge is," she said. "I generally come into Dodge 2 or 3 times a year," he said, "for supplies and to sell cattle when I have enough to move." "That's practical," she said. "It is," he agreed. He looked at her with those storm-colored eyes, and she looked back at him with equal steadiness. "I expect I'll be at the boarding house for some time," she said. "Once I'm settled." "I expect I'll be in Dodge sometime in late September," he said. "Then I expect we might see each other again," she said. "I expect we might," he agreed. He tipped his hat to her, a small, genuine gesture of courtesy rather than performance, and she nodded to him, and they parted in the warm Kansas evening, and Nellie Beckett walked to the South Hotel and lay down on a real bed for the first time in 2 weeks and stared at the ceiling, and thought about a man's face when his horse crossed a finish line first. That moment of unguarded, unperformed joy, and fell asleep thinking it was one of the more honest things she had seen in a long time. The stage to Dodge City left at 7 as promised and arrived in the late afternoon of the following day, dusty and rattling and thoroughly unglamorous. Nellie arrived at her cousin's boarding house with a small bag, her recovered funds, and the kind of tired that comes from relief rather than exhaustion. Martha Jenks, who was Nellie's mother's cousin, and had the same straight-spine practicality that seemed to run through that branch of the family like a seam of iron through stone, opened the door and looked at Nellie for a long moment, and then pulled her inside with the no-nonsense warmth of a woman who had very little time for sentiment, but was genuinely glad to have someone to share the work. The boarding house was called simply Jenks' house, a 2-story wooden building on the eastern side of Dodge City's main road, clean and simply furnished and running at roughly 2/3 capacity, with a rotating population of drovers and merchants and occasional homesteaders passing through. Martha had 12 rooms to let, and a dining room that served 2 meals a day, and a reputation for cleanliness and honest dealing that kept her steadily occupied. Nellie fell into the work quickly and gratefully. She cooked breakfast and supper, managed the household accounts that Martha had kept in a somewhat approximate fashion, and gradually took on the booking of rooms, which required a combination of diplomatic firmness and rapid calculation that suited her considerably better than she had expected. She was good at it. She was good at reading the guests as they came through the door, at knowing within a few minutes which ones would be easy and which ones would be trouble, at diffusing the occasional conflict between boarders with a combination of calm authority, and when necessary, the look that Martha admiringly called Nellie's courthouse face. Dodge City itself in 1879 was a spectacle of controlled and not quite controlled energy. The cattle drives from Texas were still coming in great numbers up the Kishom Trail, and the city accommodated them with the particular mix of commerce and chaos that characterized every cow town at the height of the season. The Long Branch Saloon competed with half a dozen others for the drovers' dollars. The marshal's office was perpetually occupied. The smell of cattle was omnipresent, and the sounds of the place, the lowing herds, the piano music from the saloons, the crack of freight wagon wheels on the hard-packed road, composed a kind of relentless, specific music that Nellie found she could tune out and listen to simultaneously depending on her mood. She wrote to no one about Ira Crawford because there was genuinely nothing yet to write about. He was a man she had spoken to for one afternoon and evening, who owned a horse she had bet her last penny on, who had dark gray eyes and an honest face, and had smiled at her exactly once in a way she still found herself thinking about occasionally when she was not paying attention to anything else. She was not a woman who built elaborate futures out of brief conversations. She had been disappointed too many times by the gap between how people appeared on first meeting and who they turned out to be over time. She was cautious with herself the way she was cautious with money, spending neither where the return was uncertain. But she thought about him. Occasionally and then somewhat regularly, and then with enough frequency that she noticed the frequency and cataloged it as information worth keeping. September came to Dodge City in waves of gold and cooling air, the cattle season beginning to slow, the trail crews heading back south, the town settling into its slightly calmer off-season character. Nellie had established herself enough at Jenks' house that Martha trusted her with the books entirely, and had begun talking about expanding, possibly adding 3 more rooms in the spring if the winter income held. On the 3rd Saturday of September, Nellie was in the dining room reconciling the week's accounts when she heard the particular sound of a horse being brought around to the side of the building, which was where the water trough was, and looked up from habit. She could see through the dining room window a portion of the side yard, and what she saw was a roan horse with a coat the color of dried blood drinking from the trough, with the thorough, methodical concentration of an animal that had traveled some distance. She set down her pen. She was not running. She walked through the dining room and through the front door at a normal pace and around the side of the building, and Ira Crawford was there, taller than she remembered, or perhaps she had just stopped remembering accurately, in the same kind of clean canvas shirt, and with the same amount of considered plainness about him. He had a second horse on a lead rope, a compact sorrel loaded with supply bags. He saw her come around the corner, and his expression did the thing she had remembered, that careful recalibration followed by something that was not quite managed. "Miss Beckett," he said. "Mr. Crawford," she said. "You're a few days ahead of late September." "I found I had reason to come early," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. Cinder lifted his head from the water trough and regarded them both with the dignified tolerance of an animal above petty interpersonal dynamics. "Are you looking for a room?" she asked. "If you have one," he said. "We have 2 open," she said. "Come inside and I'll get you the book." He tied both horses and followed her inside, and Martha emerged from the kitchen, looked at the 2 of them with the swift and accurate assessment of a woman who had run a boarding house long enough to read situations immediately, and said nothing except to offer coffee, which Ira accepted gratefully. He stayed 4 days. He had come for supplies, which was true, and took about 2 hours on the first morning. The remaining 3.5 days were composed of meals at the boarding house table and long evenings on the front porch, and several long walks around the edges of the town, where they talked with the ease of people who had somehow skipped several stages of acquaintance, and arrived directly at the kind of conversation that usually takes months to earn. He told her about the ranch in more detail, about the specific problems of the first winter when he had not banked the foundation properly, and the pipes had frozen, about the neighbors he had gradually come to know. The Morales family 2 miles east, who ran a few hundred sheep, and whose daughter Rosa was 7 years old, and had decided that Cinder was her personal property, and visited the horse so frequently that Ira had essentially had to build a second small paddock to accommodate her expectations. He told her about the loneliness of the first year, not with the air of a man wanting sympathy, but with the honesty of someone who has examined a difficult period and come out the other side with a clear understanding of it. Nellie told him about Nashville in more detail, about her father who had been a horse trader and a kind man who told bad jokes and cried at church hymns, about her mother who had been formidable and loving in equal and complementary measure, about the sister who had died in infancy before the war and the brother who had survived the war but not the years after, lost to the particular slow catastrophe of a man who came home changed in ways no one knew how to address. "Where is your brother now?" Ira asked. "Missouri, last I heard," she said. "He has a wife. I hope he is well. We don't write much. It was too hard for a while, and then we both got into the habit of not writing, and now it would feel strange to start again." "You could start again anyway," he said. She looked at him. "That's simple enough advice." "Most good advice is," he said. On the 3rd evening they sat on the porch in the dark, and the town was quieter than usual for a Saturday, a cool wind coming from the north carrying the first real hint of autumn, and Nellie had a shawl around her shoulders and was looking at the stars, which were extremely clear and numerous above the dark flat of the surrounding land. "I've been thinking," Ira said, in the tone of a man who has been thinking for considerably longer than he is going to admit, "about the spring." "What about it?" she asked. "I need someone who can help with the books," he said. The operation is getting large enough that I'm making mistakes, things I'm not tracking the way I should. I know that. I'm good with cattle and horses, and I'm middling at everything else." Nellie said nothing, waiting. "I also need someone who knows horses," he said. "I've been thinking about breeding, not just cattle. Cinder is 9, but he's got years left and there's demand for good stock." He paused. "I keep thinking that if I had someone who understood what I see in him, who could help me develop that side of things, it could be a real part of the operation." She turned to look at him, and he was looking directly at her, nothing oblique about it, no pretense that this was a professional conversation about accountancy and horse breeding. "Mr. Crawford," she said. "Ira," he said. She let that sit for a moment. "Ira," she said, "are you asking me to come and work for your ranch?" "I'm asking you," he said carefully, "whether you would consider the possibility of coming to Medicine Lodge, whether you would see it, whether you would give it the consideration of someone who makes careful decisions and doesn't commit to things without understanding them." "That's a very careful way of asking," she said. "I'm a careful man," he said, "when something matters enough." The night was very quiet around them. "I made a commitment to Martha," Nellie said, "for the winter at least. She's been good to me and she's counting on me." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for tomorrow." "The spring," she said. "The spring," he agreed. She looked back at the stars. She thought about the penny, about the way she had stood at the paddock fence with that last coin in her hand and looked at a damaged horse and seen something in the way it held itself, something worth betting on. She thought about the way she had read the horse and then read the man and found both of them to be what she had assessed them to be, which was not something she took for granted. "Come back in December," she said. "If you're coming through for winter supplies." "I will," he said. "And we'll see," she said. "We'll see," he agreed. But something in the quality of the silence that followed said that both of them had already formed a private opinion about what they would see, and that the opinions aligned in ways neither of them was quite ready yet to say out loud. He left on the 4th morning, Cinder and the sorrel loaded and patient in the early cool, and Nellie stood on the porch of Jenks' house and watched him ride out and did not wave because she was not that kind of woman. But she watched until he had rounded the corner onto the main road and passed out of sight, and then she went inside and told Martha she needed an hour before she started breakfast. And Martha, who had not missed a single evening on the porch over the past 4 days, said "Take 2" and went back to the kitchen with an expression of careful restraint. He came back in December, as he had said. And then again in February, when there was no particular reason to make the 60-mile ride in winter cold, except that he had said he would. He stayed 3 days each time, and they talked and walked and sat in the dining room after the other boarders had gone to bed. And in February, on his last evening, he reached across the table and put his hand over hers very briefly, and then withdrew it. And neither of them said anything about it, but the temperature in the room seemed to change. In early March, he wrote a letter which took him, she suspected, considerably more effort than the practical content warranted. He wrote that the ranch was doing well and that he had spoken to his neighbor Emilio Morales about the horse breeding idea, and that Emilio thought it was sound. He wrote that the spring planting was underway, and that Cinder had spent most of February standing in the paddock watching the horizon with an air of deep contemplation. He wrote, at the very end, that he hoped she was well, and that he was looking forward to seeing her in the spring, and that Medicine Lodge was quite beautiful when it was not midwinter. She wrote back immediately, which she recognized as a departure from her usual caution and decided was acceptable. She wrote about the boarding house and the winter accounts, and a funny incident with a traveling salesman who had mistaken Martha for a general store proprietress, and spent 20 minutes trying to sell her patent medicine before realizing his error. She wrote about a mare she had helped the livery stable owner assess for a lameness issue, and had correctly identified a problem with the hoof balance that the veterinarian had subsequently confirmed. She wrote that she was looking forward to the spring. She did not write about the fact that she thought about him consistently, and that Dodge City had begun to feel like a waiting room, which was a very different feeling from the first months when it had felt like a destination. The spring came in early April, the Kansas plains turning from brown to a vivid, particular green that seemed almost aggressive after the long gray of winter. Martha had hired a girl from town to help in the kitchen, and the spring expansion of 3 new rooms was underway, and the boarding house was doing well enough that Nellie's continued presence was helpful but no longer quite critical. Ira arrived in the second week of April. He did not ride ahead this time, which was itself a kind of statement. He appeared on the road in the late morning on Cinder, who was in excellent spring form and clearly pleased with the world, and Nellie saw him from the upstairs window where she was making up a room, and stood there for a moment before going downstairs at a pace she declined to examine. She opened the front door as he was coming up the porch steps, and they stood there looking at each other in the bright spring light, and he had brought her something, a paper-wrapped parcel that he held out with the manner of a man who was not accustomed to giving gifts and was very aware of this. She opened it. It was a book, a copy of John Stuart Mill's Principles of Political Economy, well used but intact, with a small pencil note on the inside cover that said simply, "For someone who understands value better than most." I see she looked up from the book. He was watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before, something stripped of its usual caution, something that was simply, plainly hopeful. "Come inside," she said, her voice not entirely steady. "Martha has coffee." Martha had coffee and the wisdom to find reasons to be in the kitchen for the next hour, during which Nellie and Ira sat at the dining room table and did not talk about the book or the ranch or anything practical for several minutes, and then Ira set down his coffee cup and said, "I want to ask you something directly." "All right," she said. "I would like you to come to Medicine Lodge," he said. "Not to work for me. I want to be clear about that." He paused. "I would like you to come as my wife, if that is something you would want. And I want to say that I'm not asking because I need someone to run the accounts or because I need a cook. I'm asking because the last 8 months have made it very clear to me that I would like to spend the rest of my life talking to you, and I would like to do it properly if you'll let me." Nellie Beckett sat across from Ira Crawford in the morning light of a Kansas spring, and thought about a penny spinning in her hand and a broken horse, and a man leaning on a fence who could not quite watch the thing he cared about lose, and she thought about 8 months of conversations that had been, she now realized, the most sustained and genuine pleasure she had experienced in years. And she thought about the book on the table and the note in his handwriting and the way she had stood at that upstairs window this morning and felt something unclench in her chest when she saw him on the road. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, yes," she said again, clearly. "I'll marry you, Ira Crawford, and I'll come to Medicine Lodge, and I'll run your accounts and breed your horses and argue with you about everything I disagree with you on, which I expect will be a fair amount." He was smiling fully now, that remarkable, transformative smile, and she found she was smiling too, which was not something she did casually. "I expect it will be," he said, "and I find that I am looking forward to every word of it." Martha came out of the kitchen at that moment with fresh coffee and an expression of absolute composure that did not fool either of them for a single second. She poured the coffee and looked at Nellie and then at Ira and then said, "I'll need about 6 weeks' notice to hire properly." "6 weeks is fine," Nellie said. "Good," said Martha, and went back to the kitchen, and they could hear her humming. They were married in Dodge City on the 28th of May, 1879, in a small ceremony at the church on the north end of town. Martha stood up for Nellie. Ira's neighbor Emilio Morales had ridden up for the occasion and stood up for Ira, and Emilio's wife Consuela and their daughter Rosa sat in the front row. And Rosa spent most of the ceremony watching Cinder through the church window since Ira had tied the horse outside rather than leaving him at the livery, correctly predicting that Rosa would derive more comfort from proximity to the horse than from the ceremony itself. Nellie wore her best dress, which was a deep blue that she had bought with part of her winter savings, and altered herself to fit properly. And she wore her hair up with a few small flowers that Consuela had brought from the Morale's garden. She was not a woman who had spent her girlhood imagining wedding ceremonies, but she stood in the church and looked at Ira Crawford in his clean dark suit, which fit him with the slight stiffness of a man not accustomed to suits, but wearing one with genuine willingness, and she felt something she could only describe as rightness. The sense of a thing clicking into place that had been slightly misaligned for years. He looked at her the way he had looked at Cinder crossing the finish line, that particular quality of unguarded feeling, except directed and certain in a way that the horse race never could be. She received the look without deflecting it, which was new for her, the willingness to be seen fully and to let that be what it was. They said the words. They meant them. The ride to Medicine Lodge 2 days later was 60 miles and took most of a day and a half, traveling with a wagon loaded with Nellie's things and the supply purchases Ira had been making. Cinder was tied to the back of the wagon for the journey, which he tolerated with expressions of profound philosophical suffering. The sorrel, whose name she learned was Ambrose, pulled the wagon with the patient steadiness of an animal who had long accepted responsibility. The ranch appeared in the late afternoon of the second day, set in a slight fold of land that sheltered it on the north side, with a stand of cottonwood trees along a creek to the east, and the broad Kansas grassland spreading in every direction under the vast and luminous sky. The house was small, one main room and 2 smaller rooms added on the east side, functional and clean and smelling of wood and grass and work. The barn was larger than the house, which Ira apologized for briefly and Nellie dismissed as the entirely correct order of priorities. She stood in the doorway of the house and looked out at the land in the last light and felt the specific, quiet pleasure of standing somewhere that was hers to help build. "It's good land," she said. "It is," he agreed, standing beside her. "It'll be better." She turned to look at him. "It'll be considerably better," she agreed, "now that someone is keeping the books properly." He laughed, which she discovered was a slightly rare and entirely wonderful sound, low and genuine, surprised out of him rather than performed. She wrote to her brother Thomas in Missouri that week. She wrote a real letter, a long one, telling him where she was and what her life had become and asking about his wife and his work, and saying that she was sorry they had lost the habit of each other and that she would like to find it again if he was willing. She was not certain he would write back. He wrote back in 6 weeks, 2 pages in his cramped, careful handwriting, telling her about his wife Alina and their farm, and the fact that he was doing better than he had been, better than the years right after the war when he had not known how to be a person without the structure of terrible purpose holding him together. He wrote that he was glad she had found something that felt like home. He wrote that he missed her. She wrote back the same day she received the letter. The first summer on the ranch was hard in the particular way that new beginnings are hard, full of the friction of adjustment and the specific education of learning how 2 people with established habits and strong opinions inhabit the same space without losing either the habits or the opinions. They argued about the account books and she won. They argued about the fence line on the south pasture and he won, correctly as it turned out. They argued about the breeding program and arrived at a genuine compromise that was better than either of their original positions. Ira was not an easy man in the sense of being placid or yielding. He was direct to the point of bluntness and had strong opinions about the right way to do things and was sometimes impatient when those things were done differently. But he was fair, which was not the same as easy and was considerably more valuable. He listened. When he was wrong, he said so without elaborate qualification. He did not raise his voice at her, and he did not use silence as a weapon, 2 things that Nellie had seen enough of in other people's marriages to understand were not nothing. She was not easy either. She had strong opinions and long memories and a tendency to work past the point of exhaustion, and then to be irritable about it in ways that she recognized but sometimes could not prevent. She was occasionally too certain of herself. She pushed hard at things, and sometimes the things pushed back. They learned each other the way you learn difficult and worthwhile terrain, carefully, with attention, revising your map as you go. In October, Rosa Morales came by on the small pony her father had given her for her 8th birthday and spent the afternoon with Cinder in his paddock, as was her established custom, and Nellie sat on the paddock fence and watched the child and the horse and talked to Rosa about horses in the serious, informative way she talked to anyone who was genuinely interested, and Rosa listened with the focused attention of someone who was taking notes. "Will Cinder have babies?" Rosa asked. "We're planning on it," Nellie said. "Next spring if all goes well." Rosa considered this. "Will his babies run as fast as him?" "If we choose the right mare," Nellie said. "Speed comes from both sides." Rosa looked at Cinder, who was accepting being braided by Rosa's small hands with his customary long-suffering dignity. "He's special," she said. "He is," Nellie agreed. Rosa looked at her with the directness that children deploy before they learn to be diplomatic. "You are also special," she said. "My mother says so. She says Senator Crawford is much less sad now than before." Nellie was quiet for a moment. "I hope that's true," she said. "It is true," Rosa said with authority. "I can tell. He used to look at things and then stop looking like he forgot why he was looking. He doesn't do that anymore." Nellie thought about that for the rest of the afternoon and into the evening, when Ira came in from the south pasture with mud on his boots and the particular satisfied tiredness of someone who had done what they set out to do that day. She was at the stove, and she turned when he came in, and he looked at her the way he always looked at her when he came inside and found her there, as though the fact of her presence was a piece of good luck he had not yet entirely accustomed himself to. And she thought about what Rosa had said and crossed the room and put her arms around him, which made him go very still for a moment, and then put both arms around her in return with a certainty that said there was nowhere else they were supposed to be. "Good day," she asked. "Good day," he said. She leaned back to look at him. "I think we should name the first foal something with a fire in it," she said, "like Cinder. Something that carries the line." He considered this. "Ember," he said. "Ember," she agreed. "Yes." The winter of 1879 was cold and long and closed the ranch in for weeks at a time with the particular intimacy of shared confinement. They read in the evenings by lamplight, she with the mill book and whatever else they could get from the book traveler who came through Medicine Lodge twice a year, he with agricultural papers and the occasional dime novel that he read with a private enjoyment he tried to be slightly embarrassed about, and she refused to let him be. "You read those because you like stories," she told him. "There's nothing wrong with liking stories." "They're very unrealistic," he said. "Most stories are," she said. "That's not why people read them." He looked at her over the top of the paper cover. "Why do people read them? Because they want to believe certain things are possible," she said. "Courage that comes at the right moment, justice that actually arrives, love that lasts." She looked back at her own book. "It's useful to believe those things even if the versions in the stories are somewhat embellished." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you believe them?" She looked at him. The lamplight was warm and steady in the small room, and the wind was doing something large and cold outside, and inside was very still. "I believe they're possible," she said carefully. "I believe I've seen something that looks like evidence." He held her gaze. "So have I," he said quietly. In March of 1880, the mare Ira had purchased in the fall, a gray thoroughbred with good lines and a temperament that could coexist with Cinder's strong opinions, produced a foal in the early hours of a Tuesday morning. Nellie was there for it, as she had been for most of the pregnancy's final weeks, sleeping lightly and checking the mare every few hours as the time drew close. Ira was there too, in the dim lantern-lit warmth of the barn, and they knelt in the straw together and watched the foal find its legs with the unstable, determined effort of new life. It was a roan colt, darker than Cinder, almost mahogany, with a white star on his forehead and the deep, promising hindquarters of his sire. "Ember," Nellie said softly. Ira was looking at the foal with an expression she recognized now, that wide-open quality of feeling too large to manage, and he reached over without looking and took her hand and held it. "Ember," he agreed. Also in March, Nellie realized she was expecting their first child, which she told Ira in the evening when she was fairly certain, and had sat with the knowledge for a day to make sure she was not wrong and also to compose herself, because she was not someone who fell apart at large news, but she needed a moment to understand what she felt before she could speak about it. What she felt was, she discovered joy. Not the nervous, qualified happiness she might have expected given everything, but something direct and profound and entirely unexpected in its simplicity. She told him at supper, and he sat very still for a moment, and then he said her name in a way he had never said it before, with all 3 syllables given equal weight and full attention, and she felt the sound of it in her chest like something settling into its permanent place. He came around the table and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands and looked at her with those gray eyes wide open and fully present. "Are you well?" He asked first, which was the right question, asked in the right order, and she loved him completely in that moment for his instinct to ask about her before anything else. "I am very well," she said. "Are you glad?" he asked. "Ira," she said, "I am the most glad I have ever been about anything." He put his forehead against her hands for a moment, and she felt him breathe, and then he looked up and his face was the most open she had ever seen it, cleared of every last piece of reserve. "Tell me what you need," he said. "Nothing different than what I have," she said. "Mostly." The summer of 1880 was warm and long and productive on the ranch. The cattle herd had grown to 60 head, and Ira hired a young cowhand named Pete Dawson, who was 20 years old and from Kentucky, and had an earnest, capable quality that Nellie approved of. The breeding operation was showing real promise, with Ember developing into an outstanding young colt who had, to everyone's delight, inherited Cinder's speed, and not yet demonstrated Cinder's opinions about when to deploy it. Nellie's pregnancy was easy and not easy simultaneously, the way such things tend to be. Easy in that she was strong and healthy and determined to remain active. Not easy in that a Kansas summer is a particular test, even without additional physical demands. She handled it with characteristic pragmatism, and a limited patience for being told to rest by people who were not her husband and therefore did not know what she needed. Ira, who did know what she needed, developed a very specific attentiveness that included doing the morning barn check without being asked, appearing at the right moments with food or water or simply a presence, and sitting with her in the evenings with a quality of quiet company that she found, consistently and without diminishment, to be the most comfortable thing she had ever experienced. She told him once in August, when the evenings were still warm and they sat outside on the porch after supper, that she had not expected this. "Expected what?" he asked. "To feel safe," she said. "Not safe like nothing bad will happen, I know better than that. But safe like there is someone who will be present for it, whatever it is." He was quiet for a moment. "I haven't always known how to be present," he said carefully. "I spent a lot of years being by myself because it seemed simpler. You learn a kind of distance when you're alone that long." "I know," she said. "You're the reason I stopped wanting that distance," he said simply. "You specifically, not just someone. You." She looked at the darkening land, the first stars appearing above the cottonwood trees. "I know that too," she said. In September, Nellie received a letter from her brother Thomas saying that he and Alina were expecting their first child in the winter, and that if Nellie and her husband were ever in Missouri, they would be very glad to have them. She read the letter twice and then passed it across the table to Ira and watched him read it. "He sounds like he's doing well," Ira said. "He does," she said. "He sounds like himself, the way I remember him being before the war." She paused. "I would like to go see him sometime." "When we can. We'll go in the spring," Ira said, "after the foaling season." "The whole way to Missouri?" she asked. "You haven't seen your brother in years," he said, as though this settled the matter, which it did. Their son was born on the 1st of November, 1880, in the bedroom of the Medicine Lodge ranch house, with the help of a midwife from town named Agnes Crane, who had been delivering babies in Barber County for 15 years, and moved through the process with the unflappable competence of someone who had seen everything and was prepared for more. Ira spent most of the labor in the main room where Nellie could hear him moving, not pacing exactly but unable to be entirely still, which she found both touching and appropriate. When Agnes opened the bedroom door and told him he could come in, he came in with the careful deliberateness of a man walking on uncertain ground, and Nellie was sitting up with their son in her arms, and she looked at Ira standing in the doorway and said, "Come here and meet your son." He came to the bedside and looked down at the infant, who was red-faced and already deeply opinionated about his new circumstances, and something in Ira's face went very still and very clear, the same quality she had seen when Cinder crossed the finish line and when Ember had taken its first steps, that helpless openness. "He looks angry," Ira said softly. "He'll get over it," Nellie said. "What shall we call him?" She had been thinking about this for months, turning names over in the private way she turned all significant things over. "James," she said, "after my father." Ira looked at her. "James Crawford," he said, and nodded slowly as though trying the name against the permanent record. "James Crawford, yes." He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms and watched him hold his son with the focused, startled care of a man who has never held something so important and is very aware of the weight of it. James Crawford blinked up at his father with the unfocused, ancient look of newborns, and Ira held him and did not say anything for a long time, and in the lamplight of the small bedroom, the three of them were entirely present for each other, and that was enough. The years after James arrived settled into a pattern that was full and variable and alive with the specific texture of a life built from the ground up. The ranch grew steadily, the herd improving, the breeding program developing a reputation that began to draw buyers from as far as Wichita and Abilene. Ember grew into the horse that his early promise had suggested, winning races in 3 counties by the time he was 3, and making Cinder's legacy into something documented and ongoing. Pete Dawson proved a genuine asset and stayed on, eventually taking on more responsibility as the operation expanded. He was a good, hard-working young man who was honest and capable, and who treated Nellie with the natural respect of someone who could see clearly who was running what, which she appreciated without ceremony. In the spring of 1881, they made the trip to Missouri to see Thomas and Alina and Thomas's daughter, born in December and named Margaret after their mother. Thomas was lean and weathered and quieter than the brother Nellie remembered from before the war, but the fundamental quality of him was intact, the basic kindness and the dry humor, and the way he looked at the people he loved with a fierce and private protectiveness. He and Ira regarded each other across the supper table on the first evening, with the mutual, careful assessment of 2 men who did not know each other but both mattered to Nellie. And by the second evening were talking about cattle and land, and farming with the natural ease of people who speak the same primary language. Thomas held James on his knee and bounced him, and James produced a laugh that made everyone at the table stop and look at each other with the particular joy that a new baby's first clear laugh creates. "He's got mother's eyes," Thomas said to Nellie. "I know," she said. "She would have liked all of this," he said. "She would have had strong opinions about it," Nellie said, "and would have been right about most of them." Thomas laughed, and it was the laugh she remembered, and she felt something that had been pulled tight in her for years ease slowly and carefully and completely. They stayed a week and left with the easy understanding that the distance was something they would cross regularly now, the habit of each other restored, and the future correspondence established. Alina and Nellie had liked each other immediately and without reservation, which was the best kind of liking. They wrote to each other monthly thereafter. Cinder turned 11 in the summer of 1881 and showed no inclination to slow down, his opinions about racing as absolute as ever, running when he wanted with the same devastating efficiency he had always possessed. He was no longer the damaged horse in the back corner of a paddock that no one would bet on. He had a small legend attached to him in Barber County and the surrounding territories, the horse that won when he felt like it and sat down in front of judges' stands when he did not, and whose son was now carrying that legend forward. Rosa Morales, now 9, continued to visit with the regularity of a scheduled appointment, and James, in his first unsteady steps, was already being led to the paddock fence by Rosa, who had decided that his horse education should begin as early as possible. Ira watched this one afternoon from the barn doorway, his son on his feet and gripping the bottom fence rail with both small fists, staring at Cinder with the pure, astonished attention of a child in the presence of something much larger than anything it has encountered before. "He's not afraid," Nellie said beside him. "No," Ira said. "Your son," she said with a slight smile. "Your son too," he said. "He has your stubbornness." "He has your jaw," she said. Ira laughed. He had been laughing more easily for 2 years now, the sound of it no longer rare, though it still carried that quality of being genuinely produced rather than performed. Nellie thought it was one of the finest things she had in her life, and she had a great deal in her life now. In the fall of 1881, the Indian Territory and the surrounding regions were experiencing the intensifying pressures that accompanied the push for land allotment. The federal policies that were steadily dismantling the territories promised to the Kiowa and Comanche and Cheyenne peoples who had been moved here, and the homesteaders and ranchers pushing up against those borders with their own needs and claims. Ira was not a man who held himself separate from what was happening around him, and he had neighbors who were directly affected by these shifting boundaries. Emilio Morales, whose family had been in this region since before Kansas was a state, had his own complicated relationship with the legalities of his land title, and Ira spent several evenings that autumn helping Emilio organize his documents and understand what he needed to do to protect his claim. It was not enough, what one rancher could do against the mechanics of policy and power. But it was what was within reach, and Ira Crawford was a man who did what was within reach and did not pretend the larger injustice was invisible simply because he could not fix it single-handed. Nellie respected this deeply and told him so. "Emilio's been here longer than either of us," Ira said. "His title is as good as mine, better." "Not in the eyes of the people drawing the maps," Nellie said. "No," he said, "and that is wrong, and I intend to say so clearly if it comes to that." He paused. "It probably won't be enough." "It's not nothing," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not nothing." The Morales family kept their land, partly through Ira's assistance with the documents and partly through Emilio's own formidable stubbornness and the community standing he had built over 2 decades. Rosa grew up on that land and became, eventually, a young woman who took the sheep operation over from her father with the same focused intensity she had once brought to befriending Cinder. The boarding house in Dodge City expanded twice under Martha's management and Nellie's periodic consulting assistance on the books, and Martha eventually hired a full-time bookkeeper and wrote to Nellie that she was glad Nellie had gone to Medicine Lodge because the hole she left had forced Martha to find proper help, which had made the whole operation considerably more organized. Martha came to visit the ranch twice, and on her second visit, in 1882, pronounced it a fine piece of work and stayed 2 weeks. James Crawford, by his 3rd year, had a vocabulary that he deployed at considerable length and volume, and a fearlessness around animals that required ongoing supervision. He had Nellie's coloring, the darker hair and the considering eyes, and Ira's jaw and something in the set of his shoulders that was entirely its own, some combination or departure that was simply himself. Cinder tolerated James with the patience he reserved for people he had decided were acceptable. This was not a small concession. Ira watched the old horse stand quietly while his toddler son pressed both small hands flat against the roan's shoulder and said something in the firm, instructive tone he used with all animals, And Ira felt that particular fullness in his chest that had become, over these years, the background condition of his life. He stood beside Nellie at the paddock fence, the same fence where he had stood in Caldwell 3 years ago watching a woman bet her last coin on a horse that everyone else had given up on. The same fence, essentially different land, the same quality of standing beside someone. "He's going to want to ride him next week," Nellie said, watching James. "I know," Ira said. "Cinder will be 13 this spring," she said. "He's still sound, but we should be thoughtful." "We'll put James on Ambrose first," Ira said. "Ambrose has the patience for it. And when James decides Ambrose isn't fast enough," she said. Ira looked at her sideways. "Then we'll discuss it." "We'll have the same discussion we just had, probably," she said. "But louder." "Probably," he agreed cheerfully. She leaned her shoulder against his and he put his arm around her and they stood there in the spring light watching their son talk to a horse, and the land spread out around them in every direction, wide and particular and theirs to tend. In the second month of 1883, Nellie realized she was expecting again, and she sat with the knowledge for 2 days this time, and then told Ira directly at breakfast. He looked up from his coffee and the expression on his face was the same as before, that immediate open quality of real feeling, only this time mixed with something else, something more confident, less startled. "Are you well?" he asked first, still in the right order. "Completely," she said. "Good," he said, and reached across the table and took her hand briefly. "Good." James took the news of an impending sibling with a philosophical equanimity that may have derived from the fact that he did not entirely understand what it meant, and spent the next several months conducting business as usual, which included riding Ambrose for the first time in April with a focused determination and immediate aptitude that made both his parents stand very still at the paddock fence. He was 3.5 and he sat on Ambrose's back with the natural ease of a child who had grown up reading horses the way other children read primers. "He'll be better than either of us," Ira said quietly. "He'll be very different," Nellie said, which might amount to the same thing. Their second child was born in September of 1883, another boy, which surprised them slightly and delighted them entirely. They named him William, after no one in particular, because it was a good solid name and seemed to suit the particular quality of the infant, who arrived with considerably less drama than his brother and a general air of reasonable cooperation. Cinder, now 14, was retired from racing that year, not because he had slowed, but because Ember had become the unambiguous primary horse, and also because Ira made the decision before the horse made it for him, which was the first time in their association that he had gotten ahead of Cinder's opinion on something. He announced this in the barn one evening, speaking to the horse directly, and Cinder received the news with his habitual dignified indifference, which Ira took as acceptance, and which Nellie took as Cinder being Cinder. Ember, in his second racing season, won 7 out of 10 races across 3 counties, and was being discussed in terms that Nellie recognized as the beginning of a genuine reputation. She managed the breeding inquiries that had begun to arrive with the same careful, numerical attention she brought to everything, and the horse operation became, in 1884, a formal equal partner to the cattle operation in terms of both work and revenue. Ira looked at the accounts one evening in December, the lamp burning steadily, both boys asleep, the ranch quiet and cold and solid around them, and he looked at the numbers on the page and then he looked at Nellie across the table and he said, "You know that none of this looks like this without you." "Some of it does," she said fairly. "Some," he agreed. "Not this." She looked at the ledger and the years of her careful work in it, the steady columns of a life accumulating, and she thought about a hot July afternoon and a copper penny in her palm and a broken horse and a man who could not watch her lose. "I think we built it," she said. "Together. That's different from one or the other of us." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly right." She closed the ledger. The fire in the stove was steady and warm. Outside, the Kansas winter was doing what it always did, large and cold and indifferent, and inside they were neither of those things. "Come to bed," she said. He put out the lamp. The years continued to build, the way years do when they are filled with genuine work and genuine love and genuine presence. Not smoothly, not without difficulty, not without the particular friction of two strong-willed people sharing one life, but solidly and increasingly. The ranch grew to 250 acres by 1886. Ember's foals were establishing a bloodline that breeders came looking for from considerable distances. James Crawford, at 6, rode with a natural authority that made grown men stop and watch, and William, at 3, had developed Nellie's quality of careful observation and was already watching the horses with a scientist's attention. They made the trip to Missouri every other year, and Thomas and Alina came west twice, and the cousins grew up knowing each other as easily as though the miles between them were nothing. Thomas's farm had prospered, and Thomas himself had become, Nellie thought, the version of himself that the war had almost destroyed, thoughtful and steady and quietly happy, the kind of happy that lives in the details of a good ordinary day. Cinder lived to 18, which was a good long life for a horse, particularly one who had nearly been put down at 3. He died in the fall of 1888 on a clear, cold morning, lying down in his paddock without apparent distress, simply finished in the way that content old creatures sometimes are. Ira found him and stood there for a long time, and Nellie came out and stood beside him, and James, who was 8 and understood something of what this was, stood on her other side. "He was the best horse I ever knew," Ira said finally. "Not the easiest, the best." "He carried everything," Nellie said quietly. "He did," Ira agreed. They buried him at the edge of the east pasture under the cottonwood trees by the creek and marked the place with a flat stone that James helped carry. Rosa Morales, now 16 and still a constant presence, came to stand there with them and said nothing at all, which was the right thing to say. Ember ran that afternoon, loose in the south pasture, and ran with everything he had, as though he knew something about the day that required marking in the only language available to him. The autumn of 1888 also brought a third pregnancy, and this time Nellie and Ira sat together in the evening, and she told him, and he held her hand across the table, and they looked at each other with the easy, informed joy of people who know what this means and have the specific confidence of experience. "Another boy, you think?" he asked. "I think a girl," she said. She was right, which surprised neither of them particularly at this point. Their daughter arrived in April of 1889, with Ira's dark hair and eyes that were going to settle into something between gray and brown, and a mouth that was immediately, clearly Nellie's, that precise, considering set to it. They named her Frances, after no particular relative, but because the name had a kind of clear solidity to it that suited the child. Frances Crawford arrived in the world with the contained, observant quality of someone who had decided early to take her time and understand things before committing to them, and Nellie recognized this at some deep level and felt a particular tenderness about it. James held his sister with the ceremonial seriousness of an 8-year-old given responsibility, and William, at 5, wanted to know when she would be big enough to ride, which was an entirely reasonable question from his perspective, and was answered with the patience it deserved. The land they stood on by 1890 was different from what it had been when Nellie first arrived on that wagon from Dodge City. The house had been expanded twice, an additional bedroom and a proper sitting room with a window that looked east toward the creek. The barn held 8 horses, and the paddocks were arranged thoughtfully around a central water system that Ira had designed after reading about similar systems in an agricultural journal. The cattle operation had stabilized at a size that was productive without being unmanageable for a 2-person operation with periodic help. Nellie's accounts were in perfect order, as they had been for 10 years, reflecting a life of considered decisions and steady accumulation, and the occasional bold bet placed with full knowledge of the odds. She stood on the porch in the October evenings and watched the light change across the grassland and thought about the specific path that had brought her here, the losses and the long road and the hot July afternoon with a penny in her hand and everything uncertain. She did not romanticize the hard parts. She knew exactly what they had cost. But she understood them now as the necessary geography of where she had arrived. And where she had arrived was here, on this porch, with this land, with this man and these children and this life that was entirely and specifically her own. Ira came out one such evening and stood beside her with the ease of years, his shoulder against hers, both of them watching the sky go amber and deep above the Kansas plain. "James wants to enter Ember's colt in the spring races at Wichita," he said. "He's 9 years old," she said. "He's a very competent 9 years old," Ira said, "and he's not wrong that the colt is ready." She looked at him sideways. "You're going to let him do it?" "I'm going to let him make the argument," he said, with the dignified neutrality of a man who has already decided, "and then probably let him do it, yes." She shook her head, but the shake of her head contained a smile. "The same blood," she said. "You both pick a broken thing and believe in it absolutely and refuse to be sensible about it." "It worked out with Cinder," he said. "It worked out with the penny too," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. In the long light of the October evening, in the years and weight of what they had built and who they had become, they looked at each other with the clear, uncomplicated certainty of two people who know exactly where they are and mean to stay. "It worked out with everything," he said. She took his hand. The sky went dark above the cottonwoods, the stars coming out one after another over the wide Kansas land, and inside the house James was reading William a story in a manner clearly modeled on an adult's authority, and William was listening with his particular patient skepticism, and Frances was asleep in her small room dreaming whatever 9-month-old children dream. The horses in the east paddock moved and shifted in their easy evening way. The creek made its constant, unhurried sound. Nellie Beckett Crawford stood on the porch of her home in the dark and held her husband's hand and felt, completely and without qualification, the full specific weight of what it meant to have found something worth staying for. Not a place she had arrived at. A place she had helped build, stone by stone and season by season and honest word by honest word, in the company of someone who had seen her clearly from the first and had not been able to watch her lose. In the years ahead, there would be more races and more seasons, and more arguments about fence lines and account books, and the proper raising of children with strong opinions. There would be letters back and forth to Missouri, and visits that filled the house with the welcome noise of family. There would be more horses carrying the line that had started with a roan stallion and a wire cut, and a man who bought an injured horse because it seemed wrong to let good things be abandoned. There would be more evenings on this porch and more mornings in this kitchen, and more of the 10,000 small moments that are the actual substance of a life fully lived. There would be all of it. And they would be present for every piece of it together, in the honest and enduring way that they had always been present for each other, since a July afternoon in Caldwell, Kansas, when a woman with nothing left had bet on a broken horse, and a man with too much care in him for his own peace had been unable to stand apart and let her face that alone. The stars were extraordinary above the plain. They always were, out here where there was nothing between them and the eye but clean, dark air. Nellie had been looking at stars all her life and had never found it ordinary, and she thought she probably never would, and she thought that was one of the better things about being her, this persistent capacity for finding things worth looking at. She squeezed Ira's hand. He squeezed back. They went inside, and the door closed, and the lamp light in the window was warm and constant, and outside the Kansas land lay open and silver under the stars, holding everything they had put into it, all of it patient and permanent and growing quietly toward whatever came next.